With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Welcome to the program. I especially welcome everybody there who is listening in who has had just nothing to do today and wouldn't normally listen in, but they are now because they're bored. We welcome you regardless of your rationale for watching the show. We appreciate you being here regardless. And of course, this is day one of the quarantine. I know that some of you half expected to have me broadcasting from some kind of big secret underground compound that I burrowed my way into. And I'm not saying that I'm not. But anyway, so I am going ahead and self-quarantining, as I hope that a lot of you are, to try to limit this as much as possible. Look, I get some people have to work, some people have to go in for their job, some people have to go places. I get that. But I'm saying if you can, if there is any way for you to work out to where it is possible that you could work from home or do all of your business from home, then I, of course, recommend that you do, and the CDC does as well. Now, one thing that's funny about this is when I was looking at all, and this was weeks ago, when I was looking at all the different requirements for COVID-19 or things that they recommended that you do is a better way to say that, and I was looking at work from home, score, got both of those down. I got 2 jobs, both of them happened from inside my apartment, so it was a funny thing that I was just sitting there like, yep, absolutely, that one's not going to be a problem. But we are going to try to keep you updated with all the Alabama COVID-19 news because, of course, you can go so many different places. I'm sure that some of you are even tired of hearing all the national news from the coronavirus. So we're going to try to stay primarily focused within the state of Alabama as we do everything else really on this show. We do some national stories, but primarily our focus is local news. And so because of that, I wanted to go ahead and show you this graphic. This is an update from the Alabama Department of Public Health, which, by the way, we're trying to get some of their people to come on the show and help us with that. But this is an update, and they are updating this every single day. You can look at their website. It updates, I think they said twice a day. And this is the update for the 16th. We'll go ahead and bring that up now. So as you can see, there are a few counties that do have some reported cases, the vast majority of those being in Jefferson County. Our total right now is that we only have 29 confirmed cases. Now, as I explained yesterday, we probably have a lot of cases, probably, if I had to guess, probably somewhere in the hundreds. There's no way to know that. But the reason that we're seeing cases kind of trickle in is now we're doing the test. Now, you'll look down there in your bottom left-hand corner that the deaths, of course, is still 0. Now, I do not in any way mean to use that to downplay the severity of what we're doing, and I think probably the fact that there are a lot of people that have done exactly what I and probably most of you have done, which is take some extra precautions, wash your hands a few extra times, social distance as much as possible, work from home if you can, that sort of thing, has helped keep the cases somewhat down. But we've got more than 29. But so far, no deaths in the state of Alabama, and that is a big win. Hopefully, that is a trend that will continue. Hopefully, that's something that we can keep the number of cases down, because, of course, the less cases there are, there's less chance of those people dying as well. And the first Alabama healthcare worker, unfortunately, you saw in the graphic that we just showed that Lee County has someone that is confirmed to have COVID-19. And unfortunately, that was a healthcare worker. It was a staffer at the East Alabama Medical Clinic in Opelika. So that's really interesting for me because I've been to that hospital a number of times. You know, I'm an Auburn guy. I went to Auburn during college, and during that time, I was also attending the 10th Street Church of Christ in Opelika, and I knew a lot of people that worked there. I've been down there a few times to visit. Never actually had any medical care from there. Never had to go into the hospital, thank God, for there. Pretty much all my time in hospitals has been spent either in Prattville or Montgomery. But with that facility, it's a really good facility. There's really good folks that work there, and there's some friends that I have that do work there that I'm a little bit worried about right now, especially considering one of them is also a elder at the church who works at that particular facility, and he's in the risk zone. He's definitely above 60, and so I'm a little bit worried for him. I hope that nothing happens with him, but considering one of his coworkers has been diagnosed with this, that means that he is, of course, going to be a little, he's going to be more susceptible to it, and I hope that is not the case. I hope nothing bad happens, but this is one of the things that is of the utmost concern, and that is medical staff getting infected, because really that's one of the big, what's a good way to say this, a big tripwire for the system, because as bad as it has been in places like China, like Italy, like Korea, and some of the other countries that have had some pretty significant cases of this thing, it's always bad, but it's 100 times worse when your medical staff also gets infected. When the regular folks get infected and have to be hospitalized, that's bad, of course. But then what happens when your medical staff is also down for the count? You see, when there's already a shortage of nurses or doctors because of the overwhelming amount of care that they have, if their medical staff gets sick, then that strains that to an even greater extent. And so that's one of the things that we're really looking out for. And of course, pray for the staffer there at East Alabama Medical Clinic that is going to need those prayers, but hopefully, it's not that big a deal and they get back to work, and hopefully the rest of the staff doesn't catch that too. But that's something that is a genuine concern there, and they came out with a statement earlier today saying that they are doing the best that they can to make sure that their staff is taking all the necessary precautions and remains as healthy as possible. Let's hope that works. Now, one of the things that really bothers me, and it's something that is akin to the complete live system, which was a concept that was not really developed, but certainly stated and written into a policy by the architect of Obamacare. And basically, it was a design to ration care, which always happens when government starts running healthcare. It was a design to ration care to those who are going to be most beneficial to society. So in other words, instead of having your family or having people that are taking care of you making decisions on whether or not you need care or how much care you need, what the complete live system does is it turns that on its head and says the government will determine your value essentially to the collective, and then will make decisions on how much medical care to administer. And unfortunately, Italy has basically done this. And I get that they're in crisis mode, that they're doing everything they can. I'm not attributing any kind of ill intent here, but we're seeing play out in Italy what would happen in a crisis situation where you have a huge oversaturation of demand for healthcare. And what they've done is they basically cut off all medical care to anybody over the age of 80. Because those people apparently just aren't valuable enough to society in their estimation to merit being cared for. And it's something that you never want to see. And I know that the staffers, the people, the nurses, the doctors there, they don't want to see that. I know that's not what they want to do. And I'm not trying to attribute ill will towards them. I'm just saying that this is something that should act as a teaching moment and a cautionary tale for us, because this is what socialized medicine looks like. You see, the way that care has to be rationed because of a lack of resources right now when they're in crisis mode, that's the way that it's going to be all the time when you have a single-payer system that doesn't have the market involved in it. We see it all the time in countries that do have fully socialized medicine, where they have to make these decisions to just not treat people because they don't view them as valuable enough to society. You can think of Baby Alfie or Charlie Gard. cases where the government looked at it and said, nope, it's just going to be too expensive to keep them alive. We don't think that there's going to be enough. We don't think that there's enough chance of it to work to be willing to pay for it. And so what we're going to do is ration care and deem that those people are not worth keeping alive. And unfortunately, that's what always happens when you have a government-run healthcare system, is that at some point, somewhere, you have to start rationing care. But the thing that is really heartbreaking about that is, you know, that a lot of the doctors and nurses there don't want to do that, and they hate that that's what they're being told that they have to do. Now, again, focusing in on Alabama, Dr. Scott Harris, a spokesperson for the Alabama Department of Public Health, held a press conference today. And he said that, and a lot of these things are going to be repeats. A lot of these things are going to be things that you already know, so we're going to skip through them very quickly. But these were the main points that he hit on in his press conference today to the people of Alabama. He said, stay at least 6 feet away from everybody in public, which personally, that one's real easy for me because I try to do that anyway. I don't want to be within 6 feet of people that I don't know in public. 9 times out of 10, I don't want to be 12 feet away from them if I can help it. I just stay back. I have personal space issues. So stay 6 feet away from everybody. Pretend you're Caleb Colquitt and that you just want to be 6 feet away from everybody that you would come in contact with. And with women, I mean, they just stay 6 feet away from me without me even asking them to. So that's another advantage of being me. But even with men, I'm like, no, stay back. And then another one that he said is he asked restaurants to restrict their capacity to 50%. Now, I agree with this as a general rule. If I were still working at one of the restaurants that I worked at, like the restaurant at the Hilton Garden Inn or at Moe's or one of the other places that I've worked, this would be something that made sense to me, because if you keep it at under 50% capacity, people are going to spread out a little more. They do that naturally even when there's not some kind of scare for a virus, but especially right now, they're just going to tend to distance themselves a little further from people that they wouldn't normally come in contact with anyway. So this is a good advice thing, but at the same time, I'm kind of sitting there like, well, who's going to a restaurant anyway? I mean, right now is really the time where if there is any way to avoid it, you should not be going to a restaurant. In fact, I think that if you do want to eat out, you should either get it to go, delivery, takeout, however you want to handle it. But especially in this digital age where it's so easy to get food either delivered or to just order food ahead of time and go pick it up. Like even Moe's, which I just mentioned that I used to work at, even Moe's, which is a place that doesn't typically, you don't think of it as a takeout place. You could either have it delivered, because some stores do that, or there are also services like Waiter that will do that. Or you could also do this. You just pull up the Moe's app, order what you want, walk in, it's already paid for, you grab it, you go. That's it. I mean, that's minimal contact with the outside world. And so I think especially when you consider that we live in this age of technology, my big question would be, why are they eating in a restaurant in the first place? I mean, you want to go to a fancier sit-down place that doesn't have a drive-through? Yeah, I understand that. That's fine. Order it to go pick it up, and then your time that you have to be around other people is severely limited. And if everybody does this, it will go a really long way in preventing this thing from spreading. So, good advice. I think it should be unnecessary. I think people should worry about eating in restaurants, period, not just having the restaurant's dining rooms restricted to 50% capacity. Another one that was interesting is they recommended all daycares close. And I understand that this is a nightmare for some parents to try to figure out how they're supposed to go to work and take care of their kids. But it does make sense, because younger people especially are ones that are more likely to be carriers of the virus for several days before they experience symptoms. And if they do that with a whole bunch of kids, there is a place where children actually gather to be together like a daycare. Well, you can see how it would not take very long at all for that thing to spread. And as much as I hold no ill will towards kids, let's be honest, kids are germ factories. Like, they're not very socially conscious. They're not great about washing their hands. They don't really respect personal space. And especially younger kids that would typically not be in school yet and are in daycares. I mean, the first thing they want to do when you pick them up or when you play with them is they want to put their hands right on your face, sometimes right in your mouth or right on your nose. And this is just not a good thing for when a virus is coming around. And so it's something that I get that it's a headache. I understand that people are probably upset about this, that are parents, and that's something I really can't relate to, not being a father myself. But at the same time, it makes sense. And I appreciate that so far what Alabama has done primarily is ask, not tell. Ask, not mandate. Because that seems to be a running theme with all of these. They're advising people, but they're not making it into something they can enforce with law. And that would tend to make things even worse, in my opinion. Here's another thing that he brought up. They intend to have 20 testing sites planned that are going to be all throughout the state of Alabama. I know that that's a difficult task considering that we're such a rural state and there's not a lot of central meeting places outside some of the major cities like Birmingham, Montgomery, Mobile, Huntsville, that kind of thing. But it looks like they're trying to come up with 20 testing sites that will be scattered throughout the state of Alabama. And they said, according to these testing sites, they said that most results should be ready within 24 hours and none should take over 72 hours. So this testing does take a little time. It may take a little time for you to get your results back, but if you are experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, you need to go to one of these facilities. And they said these will be up and running soon. They're currently being staffed. And one thing that they asked, and this is also good advice, please do not get tested unless you already have symptoms. Because if it's a whole bunch of people that are just being hypochondriacs and don't actually have any symptoms, they're just rushing there to get tested. Okay, first of all, that's a bad idea because it uses up resources for people that actually are symptomatic and need to know whether or not they have this thing. But the second part of that, and this may be the more important part actually, is that you getting out and about, even in a controlled environment like that where you're probably not leaving your car or having very minimal interaction with people, you are still at some level putting yourself at risk by going out if you don't have symptoms already. So if you're experiencing symptoms, you have a decent idea that it might be COVID-19, they do advise you to call ahead and let them know that you're coming if you think that you have it. But if you're going to get tested for these things, just don't do it unless you already have symptoms. Don't do it unless you have a reasonable suspicion, to use a legal term, that you might have this thing. And another thing that they're recommending, no mass gatherings of 50 people or more. This coincides with the CDC's recommendation. So if you have a gathering with more than 50 people, look, just cancel it if at all possible. You guys know how religious I am. And I talk about spirituality all the time. I almost never actually miss a day of church if I can help it. I'm one of the guys that goes 3 times a week and then has Bible studies in between those times. So it's something that's very important to me, and religiously worshiping in an organized fashion is also something that is really important to me. I don't just go to small little groups. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that I don't substitute that for larger corporate worship. And yet even I stayed home yesterday and just partook of the Lord's Supper where I was and watched worship services streaming over the internet. Didn't actually go in because I'm a high-risk individual. And so coming from somebody that takes this stuff extremely seriously, I'm saying it makes sense to take a step back and just kind of let things unfold and take precautions, because especially when you're looking at churches, that is a place where people mingle, especially people with a high degree of diversity when it comes to age. That makes this extremely dangerous. Because like I said, young people are more apt to be carrying it without experiencing symptoms for a few days, and then older people are the ones that are at a higher lethality rate. Well, what happens when you mix a whole bunch of old people and a whole bunch of young people? You can see how that would be something that's very dangerous. And so I would advise churches to take necessary steps to limit contact with worship or cancel worship altogether and just have an online service, maybe with just a few essential people that are going to be leading worship, there with you. That's at least what I recommend. And I think that is good advice. Speaking of seniors, they specifically said that seniors or people that are at risk should not gather with more than 10 people at a time. Again, good advice, because those people are at high risk, and so if there's going to be more than 10 people in a place, you probably shouldn't do that. Honestly, you should limit social interaction, period, if at all possible, but certainly not with groups of more than 10 people. And this was another big one. All interstate travel should be limited as much as possible. Now, I know that some people have family out of state, and I know that some people live on the border, and that makes life difficult for them. I mean, look at our friends at, for example, Smith Station, or people that live right on the Tennessee or Mississippi border. I get that that can be a pain if you're somebody in one of those situations. There are some people that I know that go out of state to get groceries. I have a buddy from Slocum, Alabama, that his nearest grocery store is technically in Florida, not in Alabama, and so he typically crosses state lines to be able to do that, but now's a good time to limit interstate travel as much as humanly possible. So if you're planning on taking a trip and you've planned it for a while, but it's not really essential, it's not really necessary, just limit that as much as possible. Use some common sense here. And I know that some of these things are annoying and it's a pain to have to deal with them, but it really is the better way to handle this. Now, I wanted to talk briefly about how this thing is going to impact impact the state of Alabama, at least from an economic standpoint. So a couple of things that we need to be aware of. First of all, it's probably going to have a pretty negative impact on our tourism business for the reason that I just listed. People are limiting their interstate travel. And when it comes to the state of Alabama, one thing that is a big draw for us every year is spring break. You look down at Baldwin County and some of the southern cities around Mobile, the areas around Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, that kind of thing. Those are big spring break destination areas. And considering that this thing is hitting right around the time that spring break is happening, it's going to have a pretty significant negative economic impact. Now, I don't think it'll be as big an impact because unfortunately, and I'm saying this as somebody that spends an awful lot of time with college students, a lot of college students are going to go ahead and do this anyway, which I would advise against. Even though it will help us economically, I would advise against college students doing so. I hate to lose the revenue, don't get me wrong, and I really hate it for those southern counties, but you don't need to be out there and doing stuff like this. You don't need to be traveling, especially with groups of people like that, in such a way that it's going to be very, very easy for the virus to spread that way. Another thing that it's going to hurt is it's going to hurt our oil production. Because as you know, big business, oil drilling in the Gulf. And there's a lot of people in Mobile and that surrounding area that depend on that revenue. So what's happening right now is there are a lot of things that have been interrupted in the supply chain. And because things have been interrupted in that supply chain, people are shipping things less because they're buying less things, especially from places like China where the virus is really bad. Well, because of that, demand for oil has dropped because those freighters and those shipping what's the word I'm looking for? Shipping crates are shipped most of the time via the water, and those ships run off of oil. So when that demand drops, so does the price of oil. The price of oil has hit an all-time low, at least for the past, I think they said it's the lowest it's been in 5 or 6 years. And it's expected to drop even lower. And then there was a goofy thing that happened between Russia and the Saudis, where Russia decided to back off a little bit on its oil drilling, and then the Saudis ramped it up. And so the Russians responded in kind and also ramped up their oil drilling, which caused the price of oil to drop even more. So the fact that the price of a barrel of oil is significantly lower than it normally is, that's something that's going to have a pretty substantial economic impact on some of those southern counties there in Alabama. So they get hit by the revenue and they get hit by the lack of demand for oil. Guys, please pray for the members of our southern, the southern citizens of our state. because they're going to need it right now. They're going to get hit really hard by this thing. Another thing that I think will impact us to a lesser extent, but it's going to be noticeable, is that it's going to hurt our spending on baseball and softball. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. But Alabama and Auburn baseball aren't really that big a deal. You know what? The truth is, from an economic standpoint, you're right. It's nowhere near the economic impact of Alabama or Auburn football, or really, if the past few years is any indication, even basketball. You don't have nearly as many people traveling for it. You don't have nearly as many people buying gas, buying hotel rooms, having to stop and eat at restaurants along the way on their way to Auburn or Tuscaloosa. But here's the thing. This is what you're not thinking about. The concern is not primarily for college sports. The concern is for Little League and high school sports. Because especially in the state of Alabama, not only is baseball, but softball a really huge revenue booster. And I say this as somebody who used to work in the hospitality business. We had so many baseball teams, and especially girls softball. Girls softball has just exploded in popularity of late. And so the college aspect of it plays a part. I'm not saying that it is insignificant, but I think that it pales in comparison to the amount of hotel rooms and travel expenses that are not going to be in the state of Alabama just from people that are in the state. I'm not even talking about people coming from, way off, fans coming from Missouri to see Auburn play baseball. That doesn't really happen all that often anyway. What I'm talking about is people that live 2 or 3 hours away from a big baseball tournament in the state that aren't going to go to see their son play in the baseball tournament, and that's going to have a substantial impact on the hospitality business and the restaurant business in Alabama. So that's something that's going to hit us, I think, pretty hard. And if I have to feel really bad for any one particular group, I really feel bad for the Trash Pandas. For those of you who may not know, the Mobile Bay Bears actually moved to Huntsville and became the Rocket City Trash Pandas. So up in Madison, Alabama, just north of Huntsville, you have a brand new minor league baseball team that is AA, so they will be playing the Biscuits occasionally. And unfortunately, what has happened with them is they built this whole brand new stadium, sunk millions of dollars into it, and they were ready to start getting back some of the revenue that they were losing being in Mobile. And then this thing hits right around the start of their season, because I think their season started like April 1st or April 8th, something like that. And this is going to have a pretty substantial impact. They're probably going to have to cancel their first month of games, which is really sad for me because that was the only time that they were scheduled to play the Montgomery Biscuits. And I got to say, I mean, that's something that really hurts me personally, but I was really looking forward to going up to Huntsville and watching the Biscuits play the Trash Pandas, but maybe this whole thing blows over and they wind up having a really great season, and maybe because people were kind of, stuck inside their homes without any sports to talk about, that they rebound really hard and there's a really high attendance rate for the Trash Pandas in their first year. I hope that's the case. I want them to succeed. I want them to do well. But ultimately, this all comes down to one thing. Whether you're talking about the impact on you personally and your family, whether you talk about the impact of the state as a whole, or the impact economically, Alabama has endured catastrophes before. Several of them, actually. I mean, everything from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement to things that had nothing to do with geopolitical goings-on, things like hurricanes. I mean, we've had so many hurricanes and tornadoes and events like that have just caused all kinds of economic disaster. The biggest economic impact of a series of tornadoes in the history of this country happened in 2011 here in the state of Alabama. And so we survived that. We got through that. We'll get through this. It's going to be painful for a while. It's not going to be pleasant, and the economy is not going to be what it should be for a few months. But there's a good chance there's going to be a rebound after it, and that's going to make up for a lot of the ground that we've lost. I'm not saying that for sure, and I'm not saying that it'll be immediate, but Alabama's going to be okay. We were already on the right path before all this hit. Our unemployment rate had hit record lows over and over again. and Alabama was back to work. And so I think that this is going to hamper that success. I think we're going to take some tumbles backwards for a little bit, but we're going to rebound and we'll be fine. And who knows, we may even be better than we were before or after it. So just keep that in mind. Another thing I wanted to mention, this is a really interesting story and specifically deals with how Alabama is dealing with this issue. There was a back and forth between John Merrill, the Secretary of State for Alabama, and Kyle Whitmire, who is a journalist over at AL.com. Now, before we say anything about this, I want you to know where I stand. So all the cards are out on the table. You can see everything. When it comes to John Merrill, I've been a John Merrill fan for a long time. In fact, before he dropped out of the Senate race, I had every intention of voting for him to be our next senator, over Sessions, over Bradley Byrne. I mean, I think John Merrill's fantastic. I think that he's a really good politician. I think that he's a great fiscal conservative. And then Kyle Whitmire, occasionally he does some things that I think are really good. Occasionally he does some things that I give him kudos for, and just like anybody else, I try to call balls and strikes. But he does get on my nerves, and he has a pretty obvious liberal bend, at least in some of the articles that I've seen him write or some of the videos that I've seen him do for AL.com. And so what we have here is a dispute between somebody that I really like and really think a lot of, and somebody that at the absolute best, on my absolute best day for Kyle Whitmire, I have mixed feelings about, and on the worst day, I'm just absolutely furious with him. So you would think that if there was a dispute between these two, I would obviously side with John Merrill, because he's the guy that I tend to align with more often than not. I want this to be a good lesson in not assuming that just because it's a person that you like making the argument, that it's a good argument or that they're in the right. Because as much as I like John Merrill and as much as I, at times, not always, because he does some good stuff too, but at times disagree with Kyle Whitmire, that does not outweigh the strength of the argument or the merits of what they are talking about. And this is one time where I think Whitmire actually was correct and John Merrill was wrong. So Whitmire came out with a blistering article about the State Department having no plan for the elections that were scheduled to happen on the 31st. So you know that there was a runoff. There were a couple of runoff races, one of them being for Alabama Senate, another one being for the runoff between Jeff Coleman and Barry Moore, which, by the way, we actually had an interview with Barry Moore last week. If you want to see that, check out our previous podcast. I think that was Monday's episode last week. So if you go to the Tactics YouTube channel, you'll be able to find it pretty quickly. Anyway, so that runoff is about to happen. And considering all the craziness that's gone on with the coronavirus, Kyle Whitmire asked and did his job, did what a journalist is supposed to do, which is ask tough questions. He asked John Merrill a question that was tough, but by all means a fair question. And it seemed, based on the reaction that I heard, and granted I was hearing it from the opinion column of Kyle Whitmire, so maybe it was overplayed or exaggerated or pulled out of context at least a little. The reaction from John Merrill was basically, this whole thing is manufactured. We don't have a plan in place because this thing isn't going to interrupt the election. And Kyle Whitmire is saying, why is there no plan in place? That doesn't even make sense. Even if this thing is going to blow over and not be a big deal, like you say, why would you not have a plan in place for an election that's coming up in 3 weeks? It was 3 weeks back when this thing was written. Now, I will grant that the tone of the article was unnecessarily harsh and that it seemed a little bit malicious coming from Whitmire. It was not an amicable opinion piece, in other words. But the concerns that he raised were legitimate. I didn't have a problem with anything that Kyle Whitmire asked John Merrill, and his concern about there being no plan in place whatsoever was 100% well-founded. Now, what I didn't want to see is somebody going in and acting like the world was collapsing if we didn't have a plan in place. You don't want to be one of those guys that's like, have you ever seen that episode of Friends where Phoebe has to stop a plane, and the way that she does is she says, "This plane doesn't have a phalange." This is just, phalange, of course, being a word that means one of your fingers. But her just saying that confused people, and it caused a panic, and all the passengers were like, well, I want to get off this plane if the plane doesn't have a phalange. You don't want to be that guy. And I think that Kyle Whitmire was a little bit on the edge of being that guy. I don't think he quite crossed over. But it seemed as though he was intentionally trying to cause strife, saying, oh no, there's no plan in place for the election. We're all going to not be able to vote, and everything's going to come crashing down. That kind of hysteria. And I think Kyle Whitmire came dangerously close to being that person. I don't think he quite stepped over the threshold. But nonetheless, I thought that what he was asking about was 100% fair. And I think that this is a good example of what happened on a national scale. This is a microcosm of what happened on a national scale with people that are involved in politics. Because John Merrill's response was very similar to President Trump's response, which is essentially, look, the media is making a bigger deal out of this than it's actually going to be. There's no reason to have a plan in place because this whole thing is, it's basically just the left-wing media trying to make a big deal out of nothing. Now, here's the thing. There is a kernel of truth to that mentality, because it is absolutely true that people on the left have been trying to use this to make political hay. Everybody from Joe Biden to the media themselves trying to make out that Trump is wildly incompetent and he's not handling this well, not taking it seriously, and they're trying to use that as a way to gain political points with the average voter, which, by the way, unfortunately has been working. But the worst possible response to that is to say, no, there's nothing to it, it's all just a hoax, because then, if it turns out that it's not, then you have to backtrack, which is exactly what both President Trump and John Merrill, unfortunately, have had to do, because the people on the right, as a general rule, when this whole thing started out, they were trying to downplay it as much as possible, treat it like it wasn't a real thing. And I understand not wanting to cause a panic. I get that. I try to, on this show, and have ever since we've been talking about this virus, maintained that we do not need to panic over this thing, that we're going to be okay. But you don't lie to people or choose to not go with the facts in order to try to keep a panic from happening. You don't omit the truth, nor do you conceal the truth just because you're worried about panic. Now, I get trying to stave it off as long as possible. But what really causes people to panic is for you to act like the thing that they are worried about is not worth worrying about and saying, nope, we're not even going to plan for it. The best thing John Merrill would have done, even if he at the time believed and genuinely believed that the whole thing was manufactured by the media, that it was a hoax and there was no reason to stir everybody up about it or no reason to have a contingency plan in place, what he should have done is say, look, we don't have a plan in place right now, but if it reaches a level to where we believe that something is merited by our office, then we'll get to work on it, and say something to the effect of, there are not contingency plans in place for something like this, and so we're going to be working on it right now. See, that's something that staves off panic without overstating the issue or blowing it out of proportion. That would have been a much better thing to do. And then on the left, the problem with them is they too were making it about politics, because Trump and people like John Merrill, they didn't want this thing to happen on their watch, and they were sort of wishfully thinking that it wouldn't happen, and because that's what they wanted to happen, they acted as though that was reality, which is a really bad idea. Now they've since reversed course on that. But the point is that President Trump, when this whole thing came out, he was like, oh no, it's nothing, don't worry about it. Forget about it. But, of course, now he's had to admit that it is something that needs to be taken seriously. And it seems as though John Merrill's done the same thing. And then on the left, it's real easy to be the person just sitting back in the chair and saying, no matter what they're doing, everything they're doing is wrong. The left has been playing this game for a few weeks now, where everything that Trump does is either way too much or not enough. It's way too much or it's not enough. And there's very few people, I think actually weirdly enough, the governor of California was the only person on the left that actually complimented him on his response to this thing, which is a really odd, it's a really odd person to be the one to say, you know what, Trump actually handled this pretty well. But anyway, on all of that, the people on the left, it's really easy to be a critic and just say that everything the other person does is wrong and not offer any solutions yourself, which is what, unfortunately, most of the media and the left has been doing. But true to form, and something that I think is a right move, the Secretary of State actually issued this particular press release earlier today to explain what they are going to be doing for the election. So here you can see that. So it says here that following the outbreak of COVID-19 in the state of Alabama and the declaration of national emergency by President Donald Trump and the declaration of state emergency by Governor Kay Ivey, Secretary of State John H. Merrill has requested an emergency opinion from the Attorney General's office related to the possible postponement of the March 31 runoff election. In the nature of keeping Alabamians safe from the potential spread of the virus, Merrill has asked if, under the emergency powers granted to the governor under Section 3191 Alabama Code, the governor has the authority to postpone the election. Currently, neither the Code of Alabama nor the Constitution of the State of Alabama allow for the suspension, delay, or postponement of an election once the date has been set. So a couple things we need to take away from that. First of all, when it comes to what the governor can and can't do, basically what John Merrill is asking the Attorney General Steve Marshall for is saying, okay, is it actually possible for the governor to, as a part of the state of emergency, delay an election? Because there doesn't seem to be a way for her to do that. And if not, we need to come up with a way for somebody to do that. But the thing that is kind of a concern for me is this is somewhat tricky business because you do not want to grant too much power to an elected official to stave off an election. Why? Because the elected official is an elected official. And because they are an elected official, they may have a political motivation for holding off on an election for some time. And what you don't want is to create some kind of loophole where an elected official can stave off them removing or being voted out of office or anything like that for whatever reason, whatever motive they might have, holding it off for any reason other than an actual emergency. So when it comes to this, I think that the best way to handle it, and this is just a suggestion, I'm open to other suggestions that may also be workable. I'm not saying this is the only way it should be done. I think that it would be smart to split up the decision to delay an election over many elected officials so that if they make that decision, it's very unlikely that they would all have a political motive to do so. And so because of that, I think that it should be not one person, the governor. And I understand the desire to make it a split-second decision to be able to do this quickly. But that's why instead of having an entire delegation, an entire legislative body like the House or the Senate, I think that it should be split between 5 constitutional officers. I think that's the smartest way to handle this because surely you would be able to reach all of them, or at least 3 out of the 5 in order to get a majority. So this would be my recommendation. 5 people, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the Speaker of the House all get 1 vote. So when it comes to a state of emergency, once a state of emergency has been declared, if they want to delay an election, those 5 people vote on it. And if 3 out of the 5 vote yes, then we delay the election. And they have to, as they delay it, set a tentative date, not necessarily a permanent date, but a tentative date to hold it off until. I think that that makes the most sense. And putting the Secretary of State in there makes sense because he's, of course, the constitutional officer that is in charge of running the elections. So you have a logistic ability there. you have a law enforcement officer and the attorney general that would consider any legal ramifications or consequences of this. And then, of course, you have the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker of the House, all of which are political animals by nature, but also ones that would be concerned with this, and also spreading that out, like I said, amongst elected officials. It's less likely that they will be motivated by political motivations if that takes place. It just decentralizes the power a little bit, just enough, I think, to make it to where it will be much harder for them to abuse this. But that's just my thought on it. Look, I hope that this whole thing is a learning experience for all of us. And I think that this particular episode between Kyle Whitmire and John Merrill should be a teaching experience for us specifically, and not operating on wishful thinking as opposed to what's actually going on. Because believe me, I don't want a crisis like this. And I know that there are some people on the left, not all of them, but there are some people on the left that really do, because they think it will hurt Trump. And maybe it will, I don't know. But a lot of them were operating on the idea that this was going to become a major catastrophe because it's what they wished for. And there were a lot of Republicans on the other side doing the opposite, hoping that this was going to be way overblown and overstated because that's what they wanted to happen, as opposed to operating based upon the facts and what was actually most likely to happen. That's a mistake that I think both Whitmire and John Merrill made in this particular thing. I think John Merrill probably to a greater extent than Whitmire in this particular scenario. But I think that should be a lesson to all of us to go where the facts lead, not just where we want the facts to lead. That we make our judgment based on objective truths instead of things that are subject to a person's emotions or whims or what we want to happen. Ultimately, I think that is the lesson to be learned here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more on tactics.
Hey everybody, headed south on I-65, just south of Clanton. And as you can probably tell by the view of the background here, it's raining, and it's raining pretty heavily. And it's something that I've always found very annoying, trying to drive in the rain. It's always something that's kind of a pain for me. Of course, it hurts your visibility, and it's annoying when you have to make a pit stop to head and get some gas or get something to eat. But you know, the funny thing about rain is that I think a lot of the ways in which we view it comes down to a matter of perspective. There's a great country song called "Where I Come From, Rain is a Good Thing." And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily my favorite, but it does point out a really important lesson about perspective. Because when you look at the scripture, it's very often that people will pray for rain, that they desire rain because they saw rain as something that is good for the crops, it increased the amount of food that was around, and the point of that country song is kind of the same thing. That when you're looking out in the country, people see rain as a good thing because it makes the crops grow, it's something that refreshes the earth. And another thing that you can view from the scripture is that the original rain that came, of course, in the flood of Noah was something that was very powerful and destructive and destroyed all of humanity. And yet, rain is also the way that God chooses to bless the earth by giving increase. And I really think that it goes down to this analogy, which I heard a long time ago, which is happiness, if it had a physical shape, there was a physical form or a thing that you could use to describe happiness, that shape would have to be in the form of glass. Now, the interesting thing about glass is you can't always see it. If it's clear and it's clean, it's very easy to miss that it's there. But just like happiness, all you have to do is shift your perspective just a little bit, and you will realize that the thing that you had been looking for this whole time was actually there all along. I think that's what the Bible means by being content and finding joy. And this is something that is a frequent theme of Paul's writings, which is very appropriate considering several of his writings, and the ones specifically where he talks about, I'm thinking of the book of Philippians, for example, are pieces of scripture that he penned while being persecuted for his belief. And so the difference in joy and contentment and happiness is a good thing. I'm not against happiness. I don't want anyone to think that. But the reason that I say joy is actually deeper, joy is the thing that is actually like glass. So I think that quote that I gave a second ago needs modification just a little bit. Because happiness can come and go. It's a feeling, it's an emotion. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have no control over it. Finding joy in the Lord is a completely different concept. Because it is something that is there regardless of your circumstances, regardless of how you're personally feeling that day. It's not something that is subject to the conditions of life. It's something that you make a choice and a decision that you are consciously choosing to be joyous. And the way that a Christian finds that joy, the way that the Bible describes that, is that it only comes through knowledge of salvation in eternity. Knowing that there is a all-powerful God that, despite having enough power to create the entire universe, loves us and cares enough for us to sacrifice his only son. The fact that there is a God that thought enough of us to give up his only beloved son so that he might be able to again have communion with us and to save us from the condition of our own sin. I mean, how can you know that and believe that and be anything but joyful?
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you for being with us here on Tactics Radio. Now, I do want to do a few things that are a little less tense, a little, more entertainment. But the virus is on everybody's mind, and so I do want to kind of stick with that. So I thought it may be fun to talk about the different things that you would like to hoard. Because we're all kind of stocking up on our favorite items, trying to keep them in, which apparently some of y'all's favorite item is toilet paper. I don't really understand why. I mean, I like toilet paper too. It's a great invention, but I don't need 48 rolls for a couple of weeks. Maybe you've got, 12 kids at home, and that's the reason you people are walking around with giant carts full of toilet paper. Maybe there's a lot more Catholics in Montgomery than I realized. No offense to the Catholics. But y'all just have a lot of kids. But I never understood why hand sanitizer and toilet paper was the big hoarding item. That really never made sense to me. So I just thought we'd talk about some of the things that I'm hoarding right now. First of all, I'm hoarding meat. I've got a lot of meat in the freezer right now. And that's because, not that I think that it's going to be a meat shortage or anything, because I think that's, at least a possibility. But that's not really something that I foresee any more than any other important commodity with the supply chain. But, I need to have my protein, and because I'm going to be probably cooking at home and eating here a lot more than I normally do, I went ahead and stocked up on meat and things that I was going to need to cook. I've got several pork chops, I've got a lot of ground beef, so I do want you to be thinking about throughout the entirety of this quick little segment, what are some of the things that you'd like to hoard? And by the way, by all means, fire off in the comment section below. I'd like to hear what you guys are hoarding. I just figured I'd show off a couple of the things that I've got. Another one that's really big, peanut butter. Whoa, moved my mic there. Crunchy Peter Pan peanut butter. By far the best thing that you can have. I have, you see the size of this jar? I have at least 2 more of these in the pantry right now, and usually I have even more than that. I remember one time Publix went on a buy one, get one free thing, and I got, I believe, 6 of these. And I'll eat it in a sandwich, I'll eat it just about anything, and I'll eat it just plain, straight out with a spoon. And it's got to be crunchy. Creamy is for children and old people that can't chew things. That's the only reason anyone should ever buy creamy. Crunchy is definitely the way to go. Anybody that is in favor of creamy is probably either a little kid or a commie. And I'm going to stand by that. I don't care what you have to say. So Peter Pan peanut butter, that's definitely one that I've got to have. And another one, this is an odd one, and I usually don't have these, but I figure I'm going to be stuck inside a lot, not be able to eat as much variety of food as I normally do. So this one's going to be hard to see because most of the box is green, and I know that, but koalas. Have you ever seen these koalas march? And I know it looks all goofy on the screen because this box is green, like I said. They're these little crunchy cookie-like things that have sort of a chocolate mousse thing in the middle. Really, really good. They're a Korean candy. You can get them at some specialty Asian markets, like just down the street. Mr. Chin's usually has them. And they're one of my all-time favorites. If you ever had pandas, they're kind of like pandas, but better. I don't know what it is. I guess it's just the chocolate to cookie ratio is better in koalas. But I highly, highly recommend koalas. And speaking of foreign snacks, this is another one. Actually, this is a Japanese snack. And I just got turned on to these by my little sister not too long ago, Pocky. And I've had Pocky before, but this particular one is crunchy strawberry. So it's a chocolate cookie that's covered in strawberry flavored, I don't even know what you call it, but strawberry flavored stuff. It's really, really good. I highly recommend it. And here's another one that I got. And this one is a little odd because it's so at odds with the stuff I typically like. This is called Clearly Canadian. And I like peach. That's the flavor that I've got right here. But Clearly Canadian, it's a sparkling water that has different flavors in it. There's blackberry, raspberry, and there's one other one, but I'm blanking on what flavor it is. I like peach. That's always been my favorite. And it's such an odd thing that I like it because I've had sparkling water before. I hate it. I don't like any kind of sparkling water. And I have had quite a bit of it and had to drink it before because in Europe, you actually have to specify that you don't want sparkling water if you don't want it. If you order water, they'll just give you sparkling water. This is something that I learned very quickly in Ukraine is if you order water, they're giving you water that has carbonation in it. I don't know why. It's just a cultural thing. But Clearly Canadian is weird because I really like it. I guess the addition of the peach flavoring they have makes it better for me for some reason. And another thing too, I hate everything that comes from Canada. So it's odd that I like this so much. I usually hate sparkling water and I usually hate Canadian things. But for whatever reason, I like Clearly Canadian. So I don't know. It's just the combination of everything in just the right way, I suppose. So that's a few of the things that I'm hoarding, a few of the things that I stocked up on since I knew I was going to be at home a lot. And as far as entertainment goes, I'm probably going to address that in a segment tomorrow. Some of the things that I'll be doing sort of in my spare time and ask you about some of that stuff as well. So we're going to go ahead and get back into some of the news of the day. I think that what we'll go ahead and do is I had this planned for earlier today. So we'll just go ahead and go to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And for today's daily dose of stupid, there is currently a bill that is being proposed in Alabama that would prevent video from body cams to be available. So you remember a couple of years ago, back when the Black Lives Matter thing was all the rage, and that's what everyone was talking about, there was a big debate on whether or not police officers should have body cams. And unfortunately, like a lot of the things that happened around the time of the Black Lives Matter debate, what happened is people immediately rushed to their corners without actually considering whether or not the policy was a good idea. Because if you were pro-cop, you typically were against body cameras. If you were pro, I guess, believing that every single black person that has ever been dealt with harshly or fired upon by a police officer was right and the police officer was wrong no matter what, then you were very much in favor of body cameras because it was something that could shed light on these cases. And what was really odd is if you were paying attention to this story over a long period of time, what actually happened is those sides switched. Because after several cases happened to where the body cam actually exonerated the police officer and showed that they were not in the wrong, then all of a sudden you had a whole bunch of people that previously were dead set against body cameras come out and say, oh yeah, we should have body cameras. Police officers should have them. And then the people that did the other stupid thing and automatically assumed that the victim was always right, they saw that it was allowing these police officers to be exonerated of wrongdoing. And they said, well, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have body cameras on everybody. In fact, they're not showing the whole story. And so it was really odd to see those two sides just flip on the stance that they held 5 seconds ago. But nonetheless, that's kind of how the whole thing played out. And there is a new bill right now in the House of Representatives in Alabama, and HB 373, so House Bill 373, would prevent the public from seeing body cam footage except for those in the video. So in other words, if you're in the video, you can see it, or those that the police officers or authorities wish to see it. I'm going to have to be a hard no on this. I was always in favor of body cameras. I never made the switch that I just talked about. I always thought that more transparency was a good thing. Now, I didn't like the idea of mandating nationwide every single police jurisdiction or precinct or whatever have body cameras on every single officer, just because, well, it may be a budgeting thing and they may not be able to afford these expensive cameras. And so I didn't like the idea of the federal government mandating them. But I was always in favor of body cameras and thought they were a good idea, especially here in larger cities that have a city police force like the city of Montgomery. And something that always made sense to me. But what's going on here is that when it comes right down to it, government cannot be allowed to operate in darkness. I do not like the idea of a government being able to conceal things that are being paid for by taxpayer money and done so for the benefit of the citizen, saying, nope, you can't have that anymore. So now what they're saying is, even though they're not requiring every police officer have a body camera, even though now most of them do, they're saying, no, the public, they can't handle that. They don't need to be able to see this video unless they're specifically in it, or it's somebody that the police officers or the authorities want them to see that, because, body cams don't tell the whole story. Well, yeah, they don't tell the whole story, but they tell part of the story. I mean, if you didn't want anything out in the public that didn't tell the whole story, then you would have to lock up most public records. Because there are things of public record that you can look at, whether it's court proceedings or whatever, that they give you an indication of what happened but don't tell the whole story. That's not a reason to keep the public from seeing them. Government has to operate in the sunshine. And it actually goes back to a principle that is very simplistic. It actually goes back to something I saw at a Johnny Rockets. Silly as this is, there was a sign on Johnny Rockets up in Indianapolis that I was visiting, and it said, if it is in sight, it must be right. And the reason that was up there is because all of the chefs, you could see them cooking your food in front of you. They had everything on a big griddle in front of there, kind of like Waffle House does. And so because of that, they had that big sign up there basically saying, if you can see them cooking, then we can't conceal anything, then it has to be done the correct way. That's a silly example, but it perfectly illustrates why it's important that government be transparent. I've always been a fan of government transparency. And anybody that's watched this program for any length of time knows how much I respect and revere police officers. One of my best callers from back at the time where I was doing the call-in show on News Radio 1440 during the weekdays, one of my best callers was a retired police officer. And that was one of our favorite subjects to talk about when he would call in. So I have tremendous amounts of respect. I go to church with several police officers. It's nothing anti-police about it. I'm just saying that if they're going to have these body cameras, if it is going to be something that is done at taxpayer expense, that's fine. I'm in favor of that, but people need to be able to see it or there's no point in having them. The police officer, knowing that he is being taped and knowing that, is going to hold him to a higher standard of behavior, and that's a good thing. Knowing that you're constantly being watched and supervised on the job, at any job, is a good thing. It doesn't mean you have to step on eggshells everywhere you go. And if you're doing the right thing, it shouldn't feel like that anyway. But ultimately, the idea that we're going to just be able to hide this and conceal this from everybody, as I long said, this is one of the big problems that I had with how they handled the shooting at the Birmingham Mall, where somebody was killed and they tried to turn it into a Ferguson, Missouri type thing. Well, if they just released the video footage earlier, that wouldn't have been an issue, but because they held off on it, it made it look like they had something to hide. That's a really, really bad look and a bad precedent for law enforcement officers to have. I love our cops, I really do, but they are not above scrutiny, and they are not perfect individuals. Having a badge and having taken an oath is a thing that is admirable to do, but it does not make you a perfect person. Sometimes police officers screw up. And when they do, we need to hold them to that standard so it doesn't happen again with other police officers or with them individually. That's something that needs to be understood by everybody on the police force. If we're going to give government a monopoly on violence, which is essentially what we do by having a police force, saying, no, you exclusively are the ones that have the right to do this, because, if you're defending yourself, if you're defending somebody else, that's self-defense, that's obvious. But as far as being able to investigate crimes and being able to use force against somebody, proactively, that's something that only police officers are allowed to do, which is fine, but it also means that we need to be able to review and scrutinize them when that takes place. So that's the reason that we should hold them to such a high standard. And another thing, too, is that the optics on this and pushing this bill forward, they look awful. I mean, it really looks like police officers in Alabama have something to hide on this, even though they probably don't. And that's why, even if you take the practical side out of it from a optical viewpoint, from a political viewpoint, this thing looks like they're trying to get away with something. And I appreciate that some law enforcement even picked up on this. So Jackson County Police Deputy Rocky Harnan said, and I quote, "I've been doing this for 38 years. I can remember when I started, if an officer said that it happened, then it probably happened. Nowadays, people doubt that." See, what he's advocating for is that's the reason we need the body cams. Because, yeah, maybe there was a day where if a police officer said something, that's probably how it played out, but people don't believe that as readily anymore, and so we need that extra layer of proof. This is a police officer, a 38-year veteran of police work, saying this is a good thing because it helps reaffirm that when police officers are doing the right thing, that you as the individual citizen can trust us. This is a guy that's clearly looking out for the best when it comes to police officers, saying, no, we need the public to be able to see this so that they can trust us. Another law enforcement official, this is actually a different quote from Rocky Harnan, the same guy. "Body cameras certainly help us. Sometimes when we get accused of doing things that we haven't done, we can prove that by video camera, so I sometimes think that's something we need to let them see." Again, going along with what he was saying beforehand, this is something that needs to be publicly accessible. Other people need to be able to see this because they need to see what we've done. And another thing, too, that he didn't mention this, but this is coming from Caleb, this is the backside of that. Because there is nothing a good cop wants more than to take down a dirty one, this camera is something that's essential because they don't want bad cops out there either. And if there is one bad incident of a police officer doing this that breaks the public trust, they need to know that, and body cameras help them with that. Hollywood police chief Jackson, I can't read today for some reason. Hollywood police chief Jason Helper said, quote, "Either it will help us or it will help the victims. We don't always get everything right in law enforcement, so I'm not going to pretend that video will always make us look good, but it also keeps us honest." What I admire so much about that police chief is that he's saying, just let the public call balls and strikes on us. Just let them look at the evidence, look at what we do right and what we do wrong, and let them decide for it, because we're not perfect. We need that level of accountability. We need people to be able to trust us, and one way for them to be able to do that is to be able to see that when we screw up, that we're not above the law either, that we take responsibility for that. And I applaud the police chief for saying that. As I've always said in matters regarding the police officers, I've been very, very consistent on this. Follow the facts where they lead. Don't make a decision based on whether the person was wearing a badge or not. Make a decision based on the evidence available. And one of the most important evidences that we can see is that of body cameras. I don't know who proposed this particular bill. I need to look into that. This is a horrible idea for the state of Alabama, and I hope that the House has enough sense not to pass this. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today, it really comes down to this idea that we don't need to panic, because I've heard people tell me not to tell people not to panic because it's like telling somebody to calm down when they're not calm. It never works. I disagree with that. I've seen it work before. I have told the person to calm down where it worked. I have been the person that has been told to calm down, and it's worked on me before. So I disagree with the notion that telling people to calm down or not panic doesn't work. And obviously this is something that God believes too, because if you look, one of the most common phrases in both the Old and the New Testament is God telling people not to be afraid. Now, granted, when that statement comes directly from God, it carries a lot more weight than when Caleb Colquitt tells somebody not to panic or not be afraid. But the point is, telling somebody not to freak out, sometimes it doesn't work, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work every time. And God has a habit of telling people to not be afraid. This is something that is true with Jesus when he's with his apostles. I mean, when they're in the middle of the storm, or when they're about to see their Lord and Master crucified on a cross, he reaffirms to them over and over again, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You know, keep a cool head. That's essentially what he's saying to them. And this is something that happens all throughout the Old Testament with Israel. There's no telling how many times in the Old Testament that God tells the children of Israel not to be afraid about the things that are coming up for them in the near future. And this is really reaffirmed in the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus. And this takes place in Matthew 6. This is going to be our reading today, Matthew 6, 25 through 34. Where Jesus says, okay, that's not even close to right. I don't know why we're in Deuteronomy here. All right, well, I'm going to... I'm not sure what's going on there, but I'll just have to read it for you. Matthew 6, 25 through 34. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life, as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body, as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe the lilies of the field. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow, and is thrown into the furnace, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek after these things, but your heavenly Father knows that you need all of these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. You see, whether you're talking about this or whether you're talking about your spiritual well-being, in other words, your sin, your redemption, God is a God that is primarily focused on who you are now, not who you were. And thank God for that. When it comes to our spiritual well-being, he's not really so much cared about the sins in our past. He's primarily concerned with whether or not we are continuing to live in them. He's primarily concerned with what we are going to do going forward, but he's not concerned about the person we used to be. And when it comes to anxiety, this is the same attitude that we ought to be adopting with our own personal lives, is that we are primarily concerned with what we're doing right this second. Are we doing the right thing or the wrong thing right now? Not so much hung up on the things that we've done in the past that we're upset about or we may rightfully be ashamed of and don't want to repeat, or even so much what's going to happen in the future, but primarily, are we doing the things that God would want us to do right this second, right now? That's what God is primarily focused on. And that's true whether it comes to spiritual redemption or just whether we're doing the things that God has told us to do, like taking care of our family and doing the best that we can to make sure we're providing for ourselves and for them. God's not really worried as much about the other stuff. And I want to point out that there is a massive focus on spiritual well-being here. That if you're looking through this, you understand very quickly that even though there is an aspect where you should be taking care of yourself, in other words, we all go to work when we can, when we're not quarantined. We all go to work because we know that in the future, we and our family are going to need things, and that's perfectly okay. But that doesn't mean that our spiritual well-being isn't more important. And so when the things that we're doing, even good things, even things that God commanded us to do, endanger that, then that becomes a problem. And the reason that he does not want us to be afraid, the reason he doesn't want us to be anxious, is because worrying about some horrible thing that may happen in the future is sort of the antithesis of that. We're going to be worried about our physical lives, not our spiritual ones. And this really reminded me of a fantastic quote from C.S. Lewis that it comes from one of his essays, and I'll go ahead and bring that up now, about living in the atomic age. And I want you, when you're listening to this, to just imagine instead of talking about the atomic bomb, I'm talking about COVID-19 and the virus scare that we've been having recently. Because if you think about it that way, it just fits so well. So let's go ahead and look at that from C.S. Lewis. All right, so this is the quote from him. In one way, we think a great deal too much of the atomic bomb. How are we to live in an atomic age? I am tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century, when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in a Viking age, where raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night, or indeed, as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Believe me, dear sir or madam, you and all whom you love were already sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented, and quite a high percentage of us were going to die in unpleasant ways. We had, indeed, one very great disadvantage over our ancestors, anesthetics, but we have that still. It is perfectly ridiculous to go about whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of painful and premature death to a world which already bristled with it, and such chances in which all death itself was not a chance at all, but a certainty. This is the first point, and the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things, praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friends, over a pint and a game of darts. Not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies. A microbe can do that. But they need not dominate our minds. By the way, one quick note here, you may have noticed on that graphic it says at the bottom, on living in an atomic age, 1984. I transposed the last two digits of that date. It's supposed to be 1948, not 1984. It's C.S. Lewis, not George Orwell. But anyway, so this is something that was written well over 50 years ago, when everybody was freaked out about what was going to happen to the world now that the atomic bomb exists. And Lewis was saying, look, this is not a brand new situation where, oh, look, suddenly we might die. Well, yeah, but you were always going to die. That wasn't something that was really a question. And I think that one of the big things that this really illustrates to us is that there are no new problems. This is something that Solomon observed in Ecclesiastes. That every problem that shows up, it may take a different form, but ultimately evil doesn't change. It's always present. It looks different depending on what time period you're living in. But people that were raided by Scandinavians in a Viking age, to use Lewis's analogy, that person was no more or less dead than somebody that was in Nagasaki when the A-bomb went off. And so, when we're looking at this, it makes no sense to greatly exaggerate the novelty of our circumstances. COVID-19 is no different. Yes, it is possible, unlikely, but possible, to die from coronavirus. And it is possible that we will get very sick and have to endure a great bit of pain in doing so. But the odds of us getting really sick and dying were already a possibility. So why would we greatly alter the way that we think spiritually because of that? Now, it makes sense to take some precautions. It is a little different in the sense that the atomic bomb, there really wasn't a whole lot you could do. You couldn't, distance yourself from relatives and friends in order to not catch atomic death. That wasn't a thing, but you can do that with this. So it makes sense to make some adjustments and to take some precautions. But like C.S. Lewis said, the idea that we need to radically alter our lives and change the way that we think physically or in heavenly terms, that simply doesn't make sense because we're really not in a much different situation than we were beforehand. The scientists may have added one more way for us to die, but ultimately, that shouldn't radically alter the way that we think about our friends and our family and our life or our God. Because that's something that really the status quo hasn't been greatly altered by the introduction of COVID-19. It also reminds us something that we really don't like to think about, but death is never very far away. Death is something that is constantly present in our lives. I'm a 30-year-old man who at the ripe old age of 28 was diagnosed with testicular cancer, which is a very survivable cancer, but one that can still kill you. And I had the advanced stage of it. And I only say that to illustrate that it is quite possible that you could get something just as severe or even fatal, no matter what your circumstances. And anybody else that was looking at me, looking at the statistics from the outside looking in, would be like, oh, that guy has no reason to worry about death. I mean, look at him. He's 28. He's in pretty good shape. He actually goes and works out, and he's really never been sick a day in his life. He hasn't been to the hospital since he was 8 years old. And yet I had cancer. And all of a sudden my death was something that I had to seriously think about and consider. But I had already thought about that and seriously considered it before I got the cancer because I'm a Christian who had already taken precautions to make sure that my eternal destination was the right one. And ultimately, that's something that is in a lot of ways spiritually healthy. You don't want to be that person that walks around thinking about death constantly or constantly worrying about it, because Jesus just said that you're not supposed to be anxious about things like that. But we also need to accept reality that we're not going to live forever. We may not live to the end of this broadcast, for all we know. But ultimately, it's something that we need to remember, that it is constantly there, and so it is most important to be worried about our spiritual well-being and our standing with God, rather than our well-being when it comes to our health. And ultimately, the way that we're going to get through this is the same way that our ancestors got through living in an atomic age, is to remember who we are. You notice that part at the end where Lewis talked about, he said, if the bomb comes down, it should come down finding us doing very human things. Does it make more sense, and would you more want your last memory to be huddled up with somebody in a tight bomb shelter, scared to death because you refuse to leave it at any point for any reason? Or would you rather the end come because you were outside playing with your kid or watching a movie with your significant other? You see, ultimately, while I'm 100% in favor of, and am myself, taking precautions, trying to make sure that this coronavirus doesn't wreck society or anything like that, even if it did, the truth is my standing with Jesus Christ is the same. And what Lewis was calling for there is to remember the kind of people that we are. That we don't become some sniveling coward because there is a new way for our bodies to be destroyed, because our bodies were always going to be destroyed at some point anyway. So let us ultimately focus on the things that make us who we are, the things that we really want to do. And if you are a Christian, what that ultimately boils down to is doing the will of God and trying to conform to the image of His Son. And that way, regardless of what happens on this side of eternity, we will be assured that we will be in a better place in the next. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright